I'm from Brazil, and I moved to the US in 2002. I lived in the Bay Area from 2002 to 2010, where I attended high school in San Francisco, community college in Pacifica, the University of California, Berkeley, and where I worked as a teacher. I was undocumented at that time, and after not seeing much hope in immigration reform, I decided to leave the US. In 2010, I left the US to Brazil, initially because I had to apply for a visa to Canada, but that didn't work out, and I remained in Brazil. I remained in Brazil where I enjoyed the full benefits of being a citizen, something that I learned I'd been taking for granted. I discovered that there were also undocumented immigrants in Brazil, mostly people from Haiti, Bolivia, and China. Brazil is a country with a lot of issues, like poverty, unemployment, and violence. I could only imagine how much worse those countries were if they had to pursue the Brazilian dream. I also learned that Brazil is a really difficult country for you to be undocumented in. At the smallest interactions, mostly because of force of habit, you're asked for your documents. You're scheduling an appointment. You're going to the hospital. You're going to the bank. I could only imagine how underground undocumented immigrants had to go in order to bypass all of that and have a normal life. Brazil was a difficult country for poor undocumented immigrants, but it also provided a very complicated path for those who had the means to legalize. During my time in Brazil, at the company that I worked for, we had to hire more college advisors for our program. Because of that, a couple Americans applied for the role. We had an interview, very good interviews, but then that conversation happened. They pulled me aside and they asked if the company could sponsor their work visa because they didn't have a legal visa to work in Brazil. Well, I thought, how the tables have turned. Americans in Brazil asking me for help to fix their immigration status. And of course, I wanted to help. After all, I could totally understand the pain of living in the shadows, feeling that they had limited opportunities, having to accept lower pay, being worried of people finding out they didn't have documents, being worried that they would be separated and deported from their loved ones, which were the reason why they were in Brazil. I tried to help, but it was a bureaucratic nightmare. It was not hard to get in line, but you would not know when it was your turn, when you would be able to legalize yourself and get your visa and become a full permanent resident. And because of that, both of them actually, left Brazil before ever being able to legalize because it just did not make more sense to them. The wait was just indefinite, but a byproduct of typical inefficient government bureaucracy, especially in developing countries. The most curious stories of immigration systems, though, were from what I learned in China. I moved to China in 2014 for an MBA program. I was there on a student visa, and then I changed to a work visa. The process was fairly easy to get visas, but the path for someone to become a permanent resident or even a naturalized citizen was very complicated, almost non-existent, especially for someone who did not have Chinese ancestry or another legitimate reasons. Legitimate reasons to become a citizen included really high bars. In the history of China, you've heard of someone who did not have Chinese ancestry, there was a doctor, and who saved the life of a high-level government official. He was able to become a naturalized Chinese citizen. Nowadays, we still see those cases of athletes actually giving up their citizenship so they could play for the China national team in the Olympics, for example, and becoming Chinese citizens because of that. For the normal foreigner, even if you marry a Chinese person, you're just granted a dependent visa. This dependent visa does not give you the permission to work. You don't get employment authorization. You still have to go and find a company that's willing to sponsor your work visa, which is not always easy, and where sometimes you have to give up something so that they can help you get your visa. This leads to many law-abiding, tax-paying, very long-term residents to be forever expats without a path to residency in China. But this lack of path for permanent residency is not just a case for expats. Some Chinese citizens also have to face residency issues. The prime example of this is the existence of something in China called the hukou. The hukou is like a domestic Chinese passport. It was created to prevent mass migration from rural to urban areas back in the day. But as like many people in the world, people want to migrate. People want to find the best opportunities for themselves and for their families. So people do move around. And many move to the big cities. In Beijing, there are many people who move for work. Some bring their kids to Beijing. However, these kids are not allowed to go to public schools. They are not allowed to go to public hospitals. The family is not allowed to own a house. The kids aren't eligible to apply to the universities in the state because they are not in-state residents. Imagine being a citizen of your own country and not being able to freely explore the opportunities available, and forever being from the hometown where your dad, granddad, great-granddad is from, because that's where your residency is from. When I left the US, I left because I failed to meet the criteria to legalize under the US immigration system. Little did I know that these flaws in the US immigration system were not just a thing particular to the US. It was a revelation to me that my country also gave a hard time to people who wanted to establish themselves. In fact, through seeing all these systems, I started seeing the US as a more structured place for country to accept immigrants than many other, especially developing countries around the world. In Brazil, the wait line was long/indefinite. There was no support for low-income people who wanted to legalize to waive their forms, for example. And there was overall very little information available. In China, there was clearly no path for people who lived there for a long time and wanted to become citizens or residents. The Chinese government even created residency requirements to its own citizens. Throughout my journey, living in different countries, I've learned that there are always situations where you're either at the bottom or at the top of immigration systems. It's not easy to be undocumented in the US. It's also not easy to be undocumented in other parts of the world. So the question that I leave you all with is, I think it's next. No, that's not the question. But okay, the question that I had is, in which ways were you privileged in your own country? And the initial question that I had is, how are undocumented immigrants treated in the country where you're from or another country that you know well? Thank you.